The sun beat down on the Abbott Ranch, baking the dust into a fine tan powder that coated everything. Inside, the air was thick and still, stirred only by the lazy spin of a ceiling fan that did little more than move the heat around. I was sprawled on the threadbare couch, half watching the national news, the drone of the anchor a familiar backdrop to the Wyoming silence. At the kitchen table, my father, John, sat hunched over his Remington, the familiar scent of gun oil and worn wood filling the room. He worked with a quiet, methodical focus, his hands, calloused from a lifetime of mending fences and breaking horses, moving with practiced ease. He was a man of few words, carved from the same hard, unyielding landscape we lived on. And in a developing story out of northern Maine, the anchor's voice sharpened, cutting through my afternoon lethargy. Federal authorities are baffled by a gruesome discovery. A remote settlement, believed to be the home of a reclusive religious community, was found deserted this morning. All 15 residents were discovered deceased. I sat up, the worn springs of the couch groaning in protest. On the screen, shaky helicopter footage showed a clearing in a dense forest, a cluster of simple, unpainted cabins. It looked like a place lost to time. The victims, the anchor continued, his voice heavy, were found unclothed and arranged in precise rows in the center of the compound. The cause of death, for each individual, appears to be a single fatal gunshot wound directly to the heart. There are no signs of a struggle, and local law enforcement officials, who have now handed the case over to the FBI, admit they have no leads or motives at this time. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Maine was a world away, over 2,000 miles of highway and towns I'd never see, but the story felt unnervingly close. Things had been wrong here in Dry Fork County, too. A quiet, creeping wrongness that settled over the land like an early frost. A month ago, Samuel Pike, an old prospector everyone called Sourdough Sammy, had vanished from his camp up in the Laramie Mountains. The sheriff found his tent shredded not by a bear's claws, but ripped apart as if by giant, angry hands. His gear was scattered, but nothing of value was taken. Then, 2 weeks later, a couple of teenagers from Casper, a boy and a girl not much older than me, drove their beat-up pickup truck up a logging road for a party. They never came back. The truck was found a week later, parked by the side of the road, doors wide open, keys still in the ignition. No sign of them. The talk down at Miller's General Store was a low hum of fear and speculation. Some blamed a grizzly, maybe a big one pushed down from the high country by a late spring snow. Others swore it was a mountain lion, a man-eater that had developed a taste for something other than deer. But the old-timers, men with faces like cracked leather and eyes that had seen more winters than I could count, they spoke of something else. They lowered their voices and talked about the silence, about nights so still that even the coyotes, the ever-present chorus of the Wyoming dark, went quiet. They said that's when it walked. Sheriff Brody, a friend of my father's since they were boys, told everyone to calm down. The kids probably ran off to California, he'd said, and old Sammy, well, he likely just wandered off and got lost. It happens. But I knew Sammy. He knew these hills better than the deer that lived in them. He wouldn't just get lost. "Dad?" I said, my voice sounding small in the quiet room. He didn't look up from the rifle, just slid a clean patch through the barrel with a soft hiss. "Cole." "You hear that? About Maine?" He grunted, a sound that could mean anything. I pushed on. "It sounds weird. Like those kids who disappeared? And Sammy?" John finally stopped his work. He set the cleaning rod down and looked at me, His eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky, and right now, they were just as cold. "Not everything the FBI is looking for leaves a trail, son." The finality in his tone was a closed door. He picked up the rifle stock, his thumb rubbing over a deep scratch in the wood, a story I'd never been told. "Worry about what's yours. The sun's getting low. Go make sure the gates to the north pasture are latched, and check the deadbolts on the barn." I felt a surge of frustration. I was 17, strong enough to buck hay bales alongside any man on this ranch. But to him I was still a child to be protected from things I couldn't understand. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look on his face stopped me. It wasn't just sternness. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like fear. That night, the familiar landscape of my dreams twisted into a nightmare. I was running through the woods behind our house, the pines clawing at me with needle-sharp fingers. I couldn't see what was chasing me, but I could feel its presence like a pressure change in the air. It was huge, a moving wall of darkness that snapped trees as it came. I could hear its breathing, a wet, guttural rasp that wasn't animal or human. Each exhale was a hot blast of rot and decay against the back of my neck. My legs pumped, my lungs burned, but it was getting closer. The sound of its heavy footfalls shook the very ground. I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The house was silent, but through my open window, drifting across the still, moonlit fields, came a sound. It was a long, mournful howl, but it was wrong. It was too deep to be a coyote, too coarse and ragged for a wolf. It was a sound of profound loneliness and ancient hunger, and it made the hair on my arms stand on end. Out in the darkness, something was calling, and for the first time in my life, I was afraid of the land I called home. The next day was a carbon copy of the one before it. A routine so deeply ingrained it felt like breathing. I saddled up my horse, a steady buckskin named Dusty, and rode out to the far pastures. The work was simple, physical. Check the fence line for breaks, make sure the cattle hadn't found a new and creative way to get themselves into trouble. Under the vast, indifferent blue of the Wyoming sky, I could almost convince myself that the news report, the whispers, the howl in the night, it was all just a product of an overactive imagination, almost. But the land was different. Or maybe I was. I noticed the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty wilderness. It was a heavy, listening silence. The jays that usually screamed insults from the tops of the ponderosa pines were gone. The rustle of ground squirrels in the underbrush was absent. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. By the time I'd circled the last of our property, the sun was a bleeding smear of orange and purple on the western horizon, throwing long, distorted shadows across the rolling hills. I turned Dusty toward home, the familiar silhouette of our barn a welcome sight in the distance. We were riding past Miller's Creek, the stream that marked the edge of our land, where the cottonwoods grew thick and tangled, when Dusty suddenly stopped dead. He threw his head up, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, a low, nervous whicker rumbling in his chest. "Easy, boy," I murmured, patting his tense neck. "Just a deer." But it wasn't a deer. A loud crack echoed from the dense thicket to my right, the sound of a heavy branch being snapped in two. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the Winchester rifle holstered on my saddle. Through the deepening shadows, I saw it, a flicker of movement. It wasn't a coyote, not a wolf, and definitely not a man. It was a silhouette, a hulking block of darkness, moving parallel to us just inside the tree line. It was tall, impossibly so, and it moved with a fluid, predatory grace that made my skin crawl. A wave of cold, irrational terror washed over me. It was a feeling that came from a place deeper than thought, a primal alarm bell ringing in the oldest part of my brain. This wasn't the simple fear of a predator you could name and understand, like a bear or a cougar. This was the fear of the unknown, of something that shouldn't exist, of a rule of nature being broken right in front of my eyes.
"Hey!"
I shouted, my voice cracking.
"Who's there?"
The only answer was the sudden, oppressive silence that followed my voice. The cicadas stopped their evening buzz. The wind died. There was nothing but the heavy pounding of my own heart and the certain chilling feeling of being watched, of being measured. Then Dusty lost it. With a scream of pure terror that ripped from his throat, he reared up, his front hooves clawing at the twilight air. I was nearly thrown from the saddle. Before I could regain control, he bolted, tearing off in a blind, panicked gallop toward the distant lights of the ranch. I clung to his mane, the world a blur of sagebrush and sky, my rifle bouncing uselessly in its scabbard. I didn't need to look back. I knew we were being chased, not by a physical pursuit, but by the sheer force of a will that radiated pure menace. Dusty had felt it. He'd smelled a death that I was only just beginning to comprehend. I stumbled into the house, my legs shaking, my face pale and streaked with dust. John was where I'd left him, but the rifle was assembled now, resting across his knees. He took one look at my face and his own hardened into a mask of grim resignation. I told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. The silence, the shape in the trees, Dusty's terror. I expected him to call me a fool, to tell me I'd been spooked by a shadow. Instead, he listened, his expression unreadable. When I finished, a heavy silence fell between us. He finally stood up, his joints popping softly. He walked to the gun rack by the door and took down his own rifle. "I warned you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I told you to be back before sunset." He turned to face me, and the weariness in his eyes made him look 20 years older. "This isn't a game, Cole. You don't go off the property after dark. Not anymore. And from now on, you keep that Winchester of yours loaded. Always." He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to say what he was afraid of. I knew. He had seen that shadow before. The chilling realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My father wasn't just aware of the thing in the woods, he was actively hiding from it. The fear I'd seen in his eyes wasn't for some abstract threat on the news. It was for the monster that lived just beyond our fence line. And it was a fear that was now my own. 2 days passed in a haze of suffocating tension. The silence around the ranch had a new weight to it, a new meaning. Every gust of wind in the eaves, every distant snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Then, on the 3rd day, he arrived. A dusty, beat-to-hell Ford pickup, a model from at least 20 years ago, rumbled up our long driveway, kicking up a plume of dirt that hung in the still air. It parked next to the barn, and the driver's side door creaked open. The man who stepped out looked like a ghost from a bygone era. He wore a long canvas duster coat the color of the dirt road, a sweat-stained cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, and boots so worn the leather had molded to the shape of his feet. In the bright Wyoming sun, he looked utterly, defiantly out of place. He wasn't just old-fashioned, he was an anachronism. My father was waiting on the porch, not with the wary caution he showed strangers, but with the quiet gravity of a man welcoming an undertaker. They didn't speak. John just nodded, and the man nodded back. They shook hands, a quick, firm grip that seemed to pass a silent understanding between them. Then my father led him inside, down the hall to the guest room at the far end of the house, a room whose door I hadn't seen open since my mother passed away. That evening, as dusk settled, other trucks began to arrive. They were the trucks of our neighbors, the pillars of Dry Fork County. Mr. Henderson, his hair as white as snow, who owned the ranch to the east. The Gallagher brothers, burly, red-faced men whose family had worked this land for 5 generations. One by one, they filed into our living room, their faces grim, their movements stiff. "This is men's business, Cole," my father had said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're not ready. Stay in your room." But I wasn't a child. This was my home, my land. The thing in the woods had looked at me. Driven by a gnawing mix of fear and indignation, I slipped out the back door, crept along the side of the house, and crouched beneath the open living room window, the voices from inside drifting out into the cool night air. The talk was of a storm, not of wind or rain, but of blood. "Another heifer torn open, Jacob," Henderson's reedy voice said. "Not eaten, just opened, laid out. Found tracks down by the creek," one of the Gallaghers rumbled. "3-toed. Bigger than any wolf print I've ever seen, and the ground was pressed down deep like it was walking on 2 legs. "The sheriff is useless," another voice spat. "He's talking about runaway kids while this thing is getting bolder." The air in the room was thick with a fear so old and deep it felt like a part of the land itself. Finally, my father's voice cut through the nervous chatter, sharp and commanding. "That's enough. Fear won't fill a grave or save our stock. The rumors are one thing. The truth is another. The beast is real, and it's getting hungrier, or maybe just less careful. That's why I made the call." A chair scraped against the floor. I peered through a slit in the curtains. The stranger from the pickup was standing. He wasn't a tall man, but he held himself with a coiled intensity, a predator's economy of motion. His duster was off, revealing a simple work shirt and worn jeans. His face was a road map of hard miles, etched with scars, and his eyes. His eyes were the coldest things I had ever seen. They were pale, watchful, and missed nothing, like a hawk's. "This," my father said, his voice laced with a deference I'd never heard before, "is Benjamin Croft." At the introduction, Croft didn't offer a name, just a slight nod to the room. The name hung in the sudden silence. He let the quiet stretch, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the ranchers, weighing and judging them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and calm, yet it carried an authority that silenced all dissent. "I will rid you of your problem," he said simply. "This isn't my first time dealing with this particular species of vermin. It will take no more than a week. I require shelter, food, and unrestricted access to your lands. My fee is $50,000. Cash, half now, half when the job is done." A collective gasp went through the room. $50,000 was a fortune, the price of a new tractor, a down payment on a whole new section of land. But after a moment of stunned silence, Meister Henderson reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the coffee table. One by one, the others did the same. They didn't question the price. They knew the cost of failure was far higher. The meeting broke up soon after. The ranchers left as quietly as they came, their faces still grim, but now with a flicker of desperate hope. Croft remained. He ate the dinner my father set out for him in silence, his movements precise and deliberate, Later, I watched from the shadows of the hallway as he sat at the kitchen table, cleaning his weapons. He had a vintage lever-action rifle, much like ours, but his was heavier, modified, and he had a massive revolver, its cylinder engraved with intricate, swirling patterns I didn't recognize. But it was the other device that held my attention. A large, wicked-looking trap of gleaming steel and complex gears, something far more sinister than any bear trap I'd ever seen. Watching him, I was caught between awe and a deep, unsettling fear. This was no ordinary man. This was a man who hunted nightmares for a living. For the next few days, Croft became a phantom presence on our ranch. He'd rise before dawn and take one of our horses. The gelding Caesar, who normally shied away from everyone but my father, followed him with a strange, placid obedience. Croft didn't just ride the fence lines, he read them. I'd watch him from a distance, see him dismount and crouch, running his fingers through the dirt, examining a bent twig or a scuff on a rock. He was reading a language written on the land that was invisible to me, a story of passage and presence. He spoke little, ate what was given to him, and spent his evenings methodically maintaining his strange and lethal arsenal. I found myself back in front of the television, a nervous habit I couldn't seem to shake. The story out of Maine was still a major headline. Federal investigators are focusing on a new person of interest in the Maine settlement massacre, the news anchor announced. The FBI has released this image, taken from a security camera at a gas station approximately 30 miles from the crime scene, just hours before the bodies were discovered. The screen filled with a grainy, time-stamped photo. A man in a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed cowboy hat stood beside an old Ford pickup, nozzle in hand. The image was blurry, the face obscured by shadow and the low-resolution camera, but it was unmistakable. The coat, the hat, the truck. It was Benjamin Croft. The blood drained from my face, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The man sleeping in our guest room, the man my father had welcomed and paid a small fortune to, was a mass murderer, the specialist, the hunter. He was the monster the entire country was looking for. I shot out of my chair, the photo burned into my mind, and stormed into my father's small office in the back of the house. He was hunched over his ledgers, the dim desk lamp throwing his face into sharp relief. "He's a killer!" I yelled, my voice raw with panic and accusation. "Croft! He's on the news! The man from Maine! The one who killed all those people, it's him! We have a murderer living in our house!" I expected shock, denial, confusion. I got none of it. John looked up from his books, his expression utterly, terrifyingly calm. Then, in a movement so fast I barely saw it coming, he was out of his chair and had me by the front of my shirt, slamming me back against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me. His face was inches from mine, his eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen, a terrifying, desperate fire. "You saw nothing," he snarled, his voice a low, vicious whisper. "You know nothing. Do you hear me, Cole? If you breathe a word of this, if you even think about calling Sheriff Brody or anyone else, you won't just be signing Croft's death warrant. You'll be signing ours, and the Hendersons, and the Gallaghers. You will get every last one of us killed." He let me go, and I slumped against the wall, gasping for air, my mind reeling. "You don't stick your nose into things you don't understand," he said, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "Some things have to be done. Some messes have to be cleaned up before they spread. My world had been built on a foundation of simple truths. Work hard, respect the land, obey the law. Now, That foundation was crumbling into dust. My father, the most principled man I knew, was harboring a federal fugitive. He was calling a mass execution a cleanup. Who were those people in Maine? Why did my father, a simple rancher in Wyoming, believe their deaths were justified? The fear I felt for the creature in the woods was suddenly eclipsed by a new, more complicated terror. The lines between good and evil, between monster and man, had blurred into a terrifying, incomprehensible gray. My mission was no longer just about surviving the night. I had to understand. I had to know what dark covenant my family was a part of, and what kind of man Benjamin Croft truly was. Dinner that night was a silent, suffocating affair. The air was thick with unspoken words. I couldn't look at my father. He wouldn't look at me. Across the table, Croft ate his stew with the same methodical calm, but I could feel his gaze on me. It was a heavy, assessing stare. He knew. Somehow he knew that I had seen his face on the screen. And in the chilling depths of his hawk-like eyes, there wasn't a hint of fear or remorse. There was only the quiet confidence of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The confrontation with my father left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I felt trapped, a prisoner in my own home, surrounded by secrets I was forbidden to understand. Needing to escape the suffocating silence of the house, I did something stupid. I told myself I was just going to check on the yearlings in the far corral, a routine chore. But I was really just running away, trying to find a piece of the world that still made sense. In my anger and confusion, I made a fatal error. I left my rifle in its scabbard, hooked over the saddle of a horse I didn't take. I walked. The sun had long set, and a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, providing just enough light to turn the familiar landscape into a place of menacing shapes and shadows. As I neared the corral, a sound from the darkness to my left stopped me cold. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the warning snarl of a wolf or the grumble of a bear. It was deeper, heavier, resonating with a chest cavity far too large for any normal animal. My blood turned to ice. My horse, which I'd left tied loosely to the fence, let out a terrified whinny, tore its reins free with a snap of leather, and bolted into the darkness, its hoofbeats drumming a frantic retreat. I was alone. I slowly raised my head, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and I saw it. Standing not 30 feet away, at the edge of the moonlight's reach, was the thing from my nightmares. It was impossibly huge, a grotesque fusion of man and beast. It stood on two powerfully built, digitigrade legs, towering over me at what must have been 9 feet tall. Its body was lean but corded with muscle, covered in coarse, dark fur that seemed to drink the pale light. Long, disproportionate arms, tipped with claws like black, curved daggers, hung nearly to its knees. Then it took a step forward into a clearer patch of moonlight, and I saw its head. It was the long, tapered snout of a wolf or a feral dog, its lips pulled back in a silent snarl to reveal a fence of yellowed, dagger-like teeth. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes. They weren't the glowing, reflective orbs of a nocturnal predator. They were black, utterly black, like polished chunks of coal, and they burned with a terrifying, calculating intelligence. There was no animal instinct in that gaze, only a cold, ancient malevolence. It didn't attack. It just watched me, its head cocked to one side in a disturbingly human-like gesture of curiosity. It was studying me, savoring my terror. A low, chuffing sound rumbled in its chest, a dry, rattling noise that was horribly, unmistakably a laugh. This wasn't a beast hunting for food. It was a monster playing with its prey. My limbs were locked in place, my throat constricted. I was paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing me into the earth. I was going to die here in the dirt, looked down upon by a creature that shouldn't exist. The creature lowered itself slightly, its powerful legs coiling like springs. It was done playing. As it tensed for the final lunge, a sound split the night. Crack thump. It was a gunshot, but it sounded wrong. Deeper, heavier, more solid than the sharp report of my Winchester. A blossom of dark fur and something else, something that smoked in the cold air, erupted from the creature's shoulder. It let out a high-pitched shriek of pure rage and pain, stumbling back a step, its intelligent eyes snapping from me to the source of the shot. Out of the darkness a figure emerged, moving with a calm, deliberate stride. Benjamin Croft. He held his modified rifle at his hip, the barrel still smoking. The creature, its black eyes burning with hatred, assessed the new threat. It gave Croft a final, venomous look that promised future retribution, then turned and vanished into the darkness with a speed that defied its massive size. One moment it was there, a solid wall of nightmare fuel. The next, only the swaying branches of the distant pines marked its passage. Croft walked over to me, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer a comforting word. He simply looked down at my trembling form, his face impassive in the moonlight. "That," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "was a size scavenger. Locals call it a dogman." He ejected the spent shell casing, a silver-colored cylinder that glinted as it fell. He gestured with his chin towards the ranch house. "Go home, kid. The night doesn't belong to men anymore." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked into the darkness, following the path the monster had taken. A hunter tracking his quarry. I was left alone, shaking uncontrollably. My entire understanding of the world shattered and rebuilt into something far older and more terrifying. The next morning, I watched from my bedroom window as Croft and my father stood on the porch. The rising sun cast long shadows, and their conversation was a low, tense murmur I couldn't decipher. I saw my father hand Croft a heavy canvas sack that clinked with the sound of metal, followed by a thick wad of cash, the first half of his payment. Croft gave a curt nod, tucked the money into his duster, and walked toward the barn, his stride purposeful. I knew then that the hunt was on. Driven by a morbid compulsion I couldn't control, I followed at a distance, using the clutter of old farm equipment as cover. I watched as Croft prepared. It was a ritual of chilling efficiency. He laid his weapons out on a clean burlap sack. He checked his rifle, loading it not with standard rounds, but with custom-made cartridges. I could see the tips of the bullets. They had a dull, milky sheen, not the coppery glint of lead or brass. Silver. He cleaned and loaded his engraved revolver with matching rounds. Then, from the bed of his ancient pickup, he hauled out the complex trap I'd seen before, its steel jaws and spring-loaded blades looking even more menacing in the daylight. His preparations complete, Croft walked over to the sheep pen. The flock huddled together, sensing the predator in their midst. He moved among them with a calm that was more unsettling than any aggression, his eyes scanning, assessing. He chose a yearling ewe, one that was smaller than the rest, and looped a rope around its neck with a single, expert flick of his wrist. The animal bleated pitifully, struggling against the rope. My stomach clenched. I knew what he was doing. He was going to use it as bait. A living, breathing lure to draw the monster out. A war raged inside me. The memory of those coal-black eyes, the feeling of its presence pressing down on me, screamed at me to lock myself in the house and never come out. But another part of me, a part that was horrified, fascinated, and desperate for answers, refused to stay behind. I had to see it. I had to see how a man, even a man like Croft, could hunt a creature from a nightmare. I had to know if it could truly be killed. I made my decision. I would follow him. I waited until he was a distant figure on the horizon, the little ewe trotting reluctantly behind his horse. Then I moved. I grabbed my Winchester from the rack, stuffing a box of standard-issue cartridges into my pockets, the only kind I had. I filled a canteen with water, grabbed my binoculars, and saddled up our quietest mare, a gentle old girl named Pearl. Staying low, using the rolling hills and stands of aspen for cover, I began to tail him. Croft didn't ride toward the woods where I'd first seen the creature, or the pasture where it had cornered me. He headed in the opposite direction, toward the Badlands, a jagged, desolate stretch of rock and canyon we called the Devil's Ridge. It was a maze of rust-colored spires and deep, shadowed gullies, a place where a man could easily get lost and never be found. It was a place where nothing grew and nothing lived, nothing we knew of anyway. As I rode, the air grew colder, the landscape more alien. The sun beat down, but the shadows in the canyons were deep and chilled. I felt like I was crossing a threshold, leaving the familiar world behind and entering the monster's territory. Every rock formation looked like a hunched creature in the periphery. Every gust of wind whistling through the canyon sounded like a low, guttural whisper. The fear from the other night was back, a cold companion riding alongside me. But I pushed it down. There was no turning back now. I was part of the hunt, whether I wanted to be or not. Croft led his horse deep into the heart of the Devil's Ridge, finally stopping in a small, natural amphitheater, a circular basin of flat, sandy ground enclosed on all sides by sheer rock faces. It was a natural killing floor. He dismounted and tethered his horse to a massive boulder near the entrance, well out of the way. Then he untied the ewe and led the trembling animal to the very center of the basin. I had found a perch high above, a narrow ledge on one of the surrounding cliffs, and watched the scene unfold through my binoculars. The lens brought everything into sharp, terrifying focus. Croft took the rope and tied the ewe securely to the base of a stunted skeletal juniper tree. The poor creature stood frozen, its sides heaving with terror, its occasional pathetic bleat echoing unnaturally in the enclosed space. Then, Croft did something that made my stomach turn. He drew a long, wicked-looking knife from his boot and made a quick, shallow cut on the sheep's hind leg. Not deep enough to cripple it, but deep enough to bleed. The scent of fresh, hot blood immediately began to permeate the still air. A dinner bell rung in the heart of the wilderness. Next, he retrieved the heavy canvas sack and unrolled his trap. From my vantage point, I could see its full complexity. It wasn't just a set of snapping jaws. It was an intricate web of spring-loaded blades, pressure plates, and steel cables, all converging on a central trigger. He spent nearly 20 minutes digging a shallow pit on the most direct path to the bleeding ewe, carefully placing the deadly mechanism inside. He then painstakingly covered it with a thin layer of sand and scattered dead leaves, camouflaging it so perfectly that even I, knowing exactly where it was, could barely make it out. His trap set, Croft began a strange ritual. He pulled a small, tarnished silver flask from his coat. But instead of drinking from it, he uncapped it and began to walk the perimeter of the trap, sprinkling its contents onto the ground. He moved in a complex pattern, tracing a symbol on the earth that looked like a knot of interlocking runes. When he was done, he produced a small, dark bottle and spritzed a foul-smelling liquid over his own clothes. The scent, a sharp chemical tang like a mixture of turpentine and something vaguely rotten, drifted faintly up to my position. It was a scent mask, designed to cover the smell of a living, breathing human. A sudden cold dread washed over me. The wind, which had been still, was now beginning to shift, a light breeze whispering down from my ledge directly into the basin, directly toward the bait. If that thing came, its sense of smell would be its primary weapon. It wouldn't just smell the blood of the ewe. It would smell me. Panic seized me. I had to move. As slowly and silently as a shadow, I began to crawl backward away from the edge. My plan was to scramble up the rock face, to get higher, to put myself above the wind's path. My boots scraped softly against the sandstone, the sound magnified 100 times in the silence. Meanwhile, Croft had finished his preparations. With the fluid grace of a lizard, he scaled the rock face opposite me, settling into a deep crevice that swallowed him completely. He wrapped his duster around himself, becoming just another patch of shadow against the stone. He was invisible. He raised his rifle, its barrel resting on a rock outcropping, and waited. An hour passed, then another. The sun vanished, and a brilliant cold moon climbed into the sky, bathing the basin in an ethereal silver light. The only sounds were the desperate bleating of the terrified ewe and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled taut to the breaking point. Every nerve in my body screamed. I was a trespasser in a sacred place of slaughter, and the long, silent wait was a torture all its own. The change, when it came, was terrifyingly abrupt. The ewe, which had been bleating non-stop, suddenly fell silent. It began to thrash violently at the end of its rope, its eyes wide with a terror that went beyond simple fear. It had sensed the arrival of the apex predator. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows at the far end of the basin. At first, it moved on all fours, a massive panther-like form flowing over the ground with an unnatural silent speed. It was a river of darkness, more shadow than substance. As it drew closer to the center of the clearing, drawn by the scent of blood, it slowed. Then, with a chilling fluidity, it rose. Up and up it went, unfolding to its full, terrifying height. It stood on its powerful hind legs, silhouetted against the moonlit cliffs, a 9-foot-tall monument to everything man has ever feared in the dark. The moonlight caught the coarse, dark gray fur of its powerful chest, the glint of its knife-like claws, the horrifyingly intelligent cast of its canine head. It didn't rush. It stalked toward the frantic ewe with a slow, deliberate confidence, a predator that knows its dominance is absolute. It was savoring the moment, drinking in the sheep's terror. From my hiding place, my body rigid with a fear that bordered on paralysis, I found myself whispering, my breath fogging in the cold air. "Go on, take it, step on the trap." And then it happened. The monster stopped dead in its tracks, no more than 15 feet from the bait. Its head, a grotesque parody of a wolf's, snapped up. Its nostrils flared, tasting the air. The wind had shifted again, a fickle current in the basin, and it was now blowing directly from my hiding spot toward the creature. It had carried my scent, the scent of warm-blooded, living prey, right to it. The ewe was forgotten. The coal-black eyes, burning with an ancient predatory light, swiveled and locked directly onto the rock formation where I was hiding. It knew. There was no doubt, no hesitation. It had found me, A low, rumbling growl of fury echoed through the basin, the sound of a predator whose hunt had been interrupted by an intruder. Before I could even process what was happening, it exploded into motion. The casual, stalking grace was gone, replaced by a burst of speed so shocking it stole the air from my lungs. It crossed the ground between us in a blur, a charging engine of muscle and rage. Panic, pure and undiluted, finally broke through my paralysis. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling with my Winchester, my fingers clumsy with cold and fear. I raised the rifle and fired 1, 2, 3 times. I saw the bullet strike its chest and shoulder, puffs of dark fur flying into the air. They might as well have been bee stings. The creature didn't even flinch. It didn't slow down. My rifle was useless. My only thought was to run. I turned and scrambled along the top of the cliff, my boots slipping on the loose rock. Behind me, I heard the scrape and scrabble of its massive claws on the rock face. It was climbing with horrifying ease, closing the distance with every second. I could hear its breathing now, that same wet, guttural rasp from my nightmare hot and close behind me. It was toying with me no longer. It was coming to kill me. Just as I felt the hot, fetid breath of the creature on my neck, just as I braced for the searing pain of its claws, the night exploded with the heavy crack thump of Croft's rifle. The dogman shrieked, a sound of agony and fury, as the silver bullet slammed into its thigh. The impact threw it off balance, causing it to stumble. I saw dark, smoky vapor, not just blood, hiss from the wound. The silver was poison to it. That single precious second of hesitation was all I needed. My brain, supercharged with adrenaline, fired off a desperate, insane idea. Instead of continuing my flight away from the monster, I pivoted, my boots skidding on the edge of the cliff, and ran back the way I came. I launched myself into a reckless, sprinting arc, heading back down into the basin toward the tethered ewe. The dogman, recovering with terrifying speed, let out a bellow of pure rage and bounded after me. Its focus was now entirely on me, the insignificant prey that had dared to wound it. Croft fired again from his hidden perch, but the creature was moving too fast, weaving between the rock formations with uncanny agility. It ignored the hunter, ignored the bait. It wanted me. I sprinted across the moonlit sand, my lungs on fire, my legs screaming in protest. I could see the spot, the slightly disturbed patch of ground where Croft had buried his trap. It was directly in my path. I didn't slow down. Pumping my legs harder than I ever had in my life, I launched myself into the air. For a heart-stopping moment, I was flying. I cleared the hidden mechanism by inches and landed in a hard, rolling fall on the other side, the impact jarring every bone in my body. The dogman, blinded by its predatory rage, didn't see the trap. It saw only me, its fleeing prey. It leaped, following my exact path. Its massive clawed feet came down squarely on the buried pressure plate. Clang. The sound was a monstrous symphony of tortured metal and shearing force. The earth erupted. A complex array of silver-edged, spring-loaded blades shot up from the sand, closing with sickening speed and force. They didn't just snap shut like a bear trap. They scythed through flesh and bone. The mechanism caught the creature mid-stride, instantly severing both of its legs at the knee and slicing one of its long arms off at the elbow. The monster collapsed with a sound I will never forget. A howl that was a mixture of utter shock and unimaginable agony. It writhed on the ground, a maimed, thrashing horror. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the flesh on its severed limbs began to bubble and smoke, trying to knit itself back together. but the silver embedded deep in its body seemed to be burning it from the inside out. A holy fire that denied it its unnatural regeneration, turning the process into pure torture. Slowly, deliberately, Benjamin Croft descended from his perch. He walked past me without a glance, his entire focus on the writhing creature. He drew the massive engraved revolver from the holster on his hip. The click of him cocking the hammer was the loudest sound in the world. He walked right up to the thrashing dogman, aimed down, and fired a single shot directly between its coal-black, hate-filled eyes. The creature's body went rigid, a final, violent shudder racking its frame. And then, the impossible happened. Before my stunned eyes, the massive body began to desiccate. It blackened, cracked, and crumbled, like ancient parchment touched by fire. In seconds, the 9-foot-tall monster was gone, reduced to a pile of fine gray ash. A gust of wind swept through the basin, catching the ash and scattering it into the night, leaving no trace that the creature had ever existed at all. The silence that fell over the Devil's Ridge was absolute. Croft holstered his revolver and finally turned to me. He walked over and offered a hand, pulling me to my feet. His grip was like iron. He looked me over, a quick, clinical assessment to ensure I had no broken bones. My voice was a raw, trembling whisper.
Was that a werewolf?
Croft shook his head, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. No. A werewolf is a man under a curse. When he dies, he reverts to his human form, leaves a body. This, he gestured with his chin to the spot where the pile of ash had been, was a dogman, Psy scavenger, an older thing. Not of this world, not really. They don't have souls, so they don't have bodies to leave behind. Just ash. It's why the authorities, the FBI, they never find anything. There's nothing to find. The pieces started to click into place, forming a terrifying picture. And the people in Maine? I asked, my voice barely audible. The ones on the news? Croft's cold eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than professional detachment. It looked like weariness. They weren't victims, kid. They were worshippers, a cult. They were trying to become one of those things. They'd found a ritual, an old one. They were close. I just finished what they started before they could open a door that should have stayed shut. He walked over, untied the terrified, trembling ewe, and began the long walk back to his horse. I followed, my mind numb, the world I knew irrevocably fractured. The journey back to the ranch was made in complete silence, under the first pale rays of the rising sun. The familiar hills and pastures looked alien now, a thin veneer of normalcy stretched over a chasm of ancient hidden horrors. Back at the ranch, Croft gathered his few belongings. My father was waiting on the porch. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. He simply handed Croft the second envelope of cash. "Thank you, Benjamin," John said, the words heavy with a history I was only just beginning to grasp. "It's my job," Croft replied. He gave me a final, brief nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Then he climbed into his old pickup, the engine turning over with a tired roar, and drove away, his truck disappearing into the morning mist like a ghost at sunrise. When he was gone, my father finally turned to me. He looked old, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. "Our family," he began, his voice raspy. "The Abbotts, the Hendersons, the Gallaghers. We're part of what the old ones called the Vigil. We're descendants of the first settlers who came to this valley. They didn't find an empty paradise. They found this land already had guardians and predators. They made a pact, a promise to keep the secret, to protect the border between their world and ours, to keep the panic from spreading. He looked out over our land, his land, my land. We watch. We report. And when one of them gets too bold, we pool our resources. We pay for men like Croft. He's part of an order, old as the country itself. They call themselves Concordia. They are the ones who do the dirty work. They are the wall that keeps the nightmares at bay. I stood on the porch, the cool morning air on my face, and looked at the hills. They were the same hills I had ridden my entire life, but now I saw them with new eyes. This wasn't just a ranch. It wasn't just my inheritance. It was a frontier, a borderland, a line drawn in the dirt against a darkness that was patient, hungry, and eternal. My childhood had ended last night in a basin of rock and moonlight. Later that day, I walked to the barn. My Winchester felt different in my hands, lighter, inadequate. I went to the old trunk where my father kept my mother's keepsakes. I pushed aside the lace and dried flowers until my fingers found what I was looking for, the heavy, ornate set of sterling silver flatware she had inherited from her grandmother. I carried it to the forge my father used for shoeing horses. I found the crucible and lit the gas torch. I was no longer just a rancher's son. I was the heir to a secret, a keeper of the vigil. As I held the first silver fork over the growing blue flame, watching it begin to glow and melt, I knew my life had a new purpose. The coyotes had fallen silent, but I would not. I was learning to make my own thunder,